I'll go ahead and turn the time over to you two. I will be here in the background if you need anything.
Great. Thank you,
Ashlyn.
Ashlyn.
Thank you to ICSA for doing this series, which
Yeah,
we think is
absolutely.
great.
Definitely.
And thank you for this opportunity to share some of our ideas. We're very happy to be back here. Last week, we did a thing on self-care and resilience, which will be up on YouTube at some point for any of you that might have missed that. Today, we're doing something different, but some of you may not know us. So I'm Linda Dubrow-Marshall.
I'm Rod Dubrow-Marshall.
We're psychologists, and we're speaking with you today from the United Kingdom. And what we do here is we work at the University of Salford, where we created the first ever MSc program in the psychology of coercive control, which is now running in its third year. And we also do private practice work, helping individuals and families that have been affected by abusive groups and relationships. And we do that with Return UK, the Reentry Therapy Information and Referral Network. And we're also active in ICSA, and I'm the mental health chair.
And I chair the research committee and network, and also one of the co-editors of the journal. And so it's really great to be here again with everyone. We don't know who you are, but we may do when you send questions in later on. But today we want to talk to you about power, threat, and meaning in the context of the global pandemic. And we'll explain why we've chosen those words. Some of you may be familiar with those already, we'll see. Others maybe less so.
It did this last time too.
Yeah,
there we go. So today we're going to give you an overview of the power, threat, and meaning framework, which we didn't make up. We're just applying it to working with people who have been in cults and other abusive relationships. And as we'll be explaining to you, this was formulated by the British Psychological Society. But the intention is to move away from over-pathologizing people, which psychologists sometimes do, don't they?
That can happen.
That's right. And we're going to look at how this applies to survivors of cults. We're the first ones that have applied it to that, and we have found it to be a very helpful theoretical framework. And we're going to look at the power and threats that we are all experiencing at the moment all over the world during this horrible pandemic. And we're going to be looking at what our threat responses are and how we're finding meaning during this time. And throughout, we're going to give special consideration to former members dealing with all of this stress. And we'll have questions and answers, which Ashlyn has offered to read out the questions at the end. So keep those questions coming.
Absolutely.
So as we said, we didn't make up the framework. We made up the idea of applying it in this context to people that have been in cults. So the BPS, the British Psychological Society, came out with this framework not very long ago, 2018. And we wanted you to have the full references because we will only be doing an overview. And if you really like this, like we do, and you want to delve into it, there's quite a long document on the BPS website. We've given you the link there. And it's called the Power Threat Meaning Framework Towards the Identification of Patterns in Emotional Distress, Unusual Experience, and Troubled or Troubling Behavior as an Alternative to Functional Psychiatric Diagnosis. So I'm guessing, even though I can't see your reactions to that, that you're liking this already, because it's the identification of patterns in emotional distress, unusual experiences, and troubled or troubling behavior. And people that have been in cults have had unusual experiences and troubling experiences. Now, the framework is hundreds of pages long, and so they very kindly at BPS did an overview, which is a very thorough overview and is actually more than 100 pages, but there is a summary and there are appendices to the main document, which are very, very helpful. Now, this came out primarily from the work of Lucy Johnstone and Mary Boyle. And so they also have an article in the Journal of Humanistic Psychology, which you can reference. And as you can see, when they wrote the rest of the framework, they were the lead authors, but they had those other people helping them. And they were all from BPS.
And just to add,
Oops, I went too far.
just to add that while they see the path threat meaning framework as an alternative conceptual system that is non-diagnostic, we personally see this as something that can be used in conjunction with regular approaches to diagnoses. That's our personal position, and that's why you'll see us doing that later on, even though in explaining the path threat meaning framework, or PTM for short, we'll see how Johnston and Boyle and colleagues saw this as an alternative.
But also as an adjunct.
Well, yes, but also non-diagnostic conceptual system tends to imply it's quite different to that of a diagnostic
it is quite
system.
different. But in practice, some of them feel it can be used in conjunction with. So there are a lot of controversies about it, and we'll get into some of that. So just where did this come from? Well, you may remember or be aware that in 2013, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual was revised. And that was the last revision, but as soon as it's written, it's being revised again. It's always in a process of constant revision. And there are many research groups that work on particular diagnoses for the next edition, and there are always some changes made. But the most recent one was back in 2013. And the BPS, like the American Psychological Association, has a division of clinical psychology. And they took the view that it was the right time to affirm publicly that the current classification systems in the DSM and the ICD, now the ICD is the International Classification of Diseases, and this is published by the very much in the news World Health Organization. And they said both of those give diagnoses for different kinds of psychological distress, or what they call functional psychiatric diagnoses. And the Division of Clinical Psychology, BPS, said there's significant conceptual and empirical limitations. So conceptual is like the theoretical basis, and the empirical means even the research shows limitations of these diagnoses. Consequently, they identified a need for an entire paradigm shift in relation to the experiences that the diagnoses refer to. And they were moving away. Remember, we said they wanted to have less pathology, to a system that is not based on a disease model.
So this gives you an indication of the origins of the path threat meaning framework. It also exposes, I think, what we could say is a healthy debate within clinical psychology, particularly in the UK, but actually worldwide, about whether traditional diagnosis-based systems, DSM, ICD, are the way forward, or whether this alternative non-diagnostic system should, in the fullness of time, replace it. And of course, there are people that have, like with any set of beliefs, exist on a continuum with regard to those sets of ideas.
Now, what it also shows you is it took 5 years to publish this, so a lot of thought and work went into the documents that we refer to that are hundreds of pages long. It came out during our first year of teaching the MSc Psychology of Coercive Control, and we very excitedly embraced it and incorporated it into our teaching. So the assumptions are that perhaps what has been called psychiatric symptoms are actually, and this is a key word, understandable responses to often very adverse environments, and that these responses actually protect people and demonstrate the human capacity for meaning making and agency. And so they evolve, these responses, and they're influenced socially. So we'll see more what they mean by that. So fundamentally, at the base of this, instead of asking people, what is wrong with you? What is your diagnosis? The power threat meaning framework asks for your story. What has happened to you? Unfortunately, sometimes people go to a doctor and they get medicine after 10 minutes, and nobody's really asked them their story. And in this story, they felt that the three most meaningful concepts that were related to human distress were power, threat, and meaning. So they looked at how is power operating in your life, or how did it operate? And importantly, how did it affect you? So power can include many things. So we're referring now to the BPS appendix. It includes biological or embodied power, and this is the power that we all feel a loss of at the moment, because not only people with underlying conditions are getting sick with COVID-19, but also there are healthy people that are threatened by this and who get sick or even die. So that's a really important one at the moment. But a really important one in cults is coercive power and power by force. But you can also have legal powers over people, money, economic and material power, social or cultural capital and power over people, and interpersonal power.
And it's important to note, of course, that these types of power can overlap. And so
Yes.
clearly in abusive groups and relationships, the coercive power is often economic or material. It's often has social or cultural features. It can be interpersonal, both in relationships and in groups. And of course, to a certain extent, it can also be biological and embodied power, particularly if
Correct.
one looks at patriarchal relations, both in abusive relationships and in abusive groups. So the question that we're applying today is, how many of these forms of power have been abused in your cultic abusive experience, if you've had it? And of course, I can reflect back to my experiences in the cults I was a member of, two examples of this form of power imbalance also, which we'll come back to that too.
Indeed. And Rod, I know that you were recruited when you were at university, and that's part of the social or cultural capital, that they influence you not to pay much attention to your university studies, thereby depriving you of that kind of
And
power.
of course, cult recruiters will typically do that in terms of the way in which they look to exploit individuals for the benefit of the group. So power relations, of course, are critical to all relationships, but particularly abusive relationships like one finds in cultic groups.
Indeed. Power also includes ideological power. So the power to tell people directly or indirectly how they should think, how they should feel, how they should look, how they should behave in order to be accepted by the group or the society. Now, what does that sound like? And the further that you as an individual are from fitting these often ridiculously high and unrealistic expectations and standards, the harder it is to hold on to your confidence in yourself and your feelings of self-worth. Power in ideological power can also be the power to silence you, to undermine the group you came from. And there are all kinds of techniques for this: criticism, putting you down, trivializing your feelings, your thoughts, undermining you, deliberately misinterpreting your views, intimidating you, or even in some groups by labeling you as mentally ill or some other version of being inferior, not right, flawed, defective.
That's right. The groups load the language in different ways to come up with those labels.
They do. And then they interpret your experiences, behaviors, and feelings and tell you what they mean. And you can see how much that would undermine anybody's mental health. Now we move on to an overview of threats. What kind of threats did the power pose? And what sense did you make of it? What is the meaning of these experiences to you? What did you have to do to survive? Now you see, that's so non-judgmental. What did you have to do? and what kinds of threat response are you still possibly using? So we just made up a list of some of the threats listed to give you the feel of it, but there are actually more in there. So just looking, the fight or attack, natural instinct versus fleeing, escaping, seeking safety, and freezing. Now, all of these are physiologically wired into us to deal with physical threats. Hypervigilance, being startled, not being able to sleep, panicking and having phobias, not remembering some of your memories, hearing voices, dissociation, which is, we know from our research, very common among survivors of cultic groups. So that can be losing track of time, place, different kinds of awareness, and depersonalization and derealization. These are all natural responses to feeling threatened. They serve a purpose. If you dissociate, then the complete power of that threat isn't as experienced by you as much. So it's actually adaptive at the time. Flashbacks, nightmares, some non-epileptic attack disorder, emotional numbing, shutting down, being flat, numbing your body, giving in, giving up, learned helplessness, which we see so much, low mood or depression, protest, weeping, clinging, being suspicious, paranoid, regressing emotionally, feeling quite childlike, withdrawing, distrusting. All of these are normal responses to threat, even though they have been labeled as symptoms. Being perfectionistic, and many more. See the appendix for other ones.
And we move on to the meaning, because the threats and the responses to the threats that we've just looked at come with the way in which we all interpret those threats. And we'll come on to that both in the setting of abusive groups and also in the context of the pandemic in a moment. But it's the meaning, the sense we make of these threats that lead to those threat responses. So feeling unsafe, afraid or attacked, feeling trapped, abandoned or rejected, feeling defeated. These are the meanings that people derive from these coercive situations, which lead to the threat responses, which often, as we'll see, are referred to normally by psychological diagnoses in particular ways. Feeling helpless or powerless is the meaning that people make of the situation of being trapped.
Yes.
That of course leads often to a diagnosis of depression or learned helplessness, that same feeling of hopelessness. That feeling of guilt and being blameworthy or responsible is another core aspect often of how people try to make sense of what is happening to them at the time. And of course, meaning doesn't mean it's correct, but these are the meanings that people try to create at the time. Likewise, people will try and make an understanding of how they're being betrayed or controlled or shamed or humiliated, how they're being overwhelmed. And again, these are the meanings from the threats that lead to those threat responses that we were just looking at. A sense of injustice and unfairness, feeling of emotional emptiness or meaninglessness that people often report as feeling when their existence, to use the Lifton term, as being dispensed with in a coercive group or relationship. That feeling of being unworthy, of feeling contaminated or evil, and there are different ways that that is described depending on whether groups, of course, are religious, in which case they may use aspects of that language, or if the groups are political, they use different forms of language to describe that. And then finally, how people feel isolated and lonely in coercive groups or cults. They may feel alienated from society more generally, and of course that's something that the groups often encourage and certainly that's also the case in abusive relationships too. That feeling of being different, abnormal from the rest of society, and certainly that was my experience in the groups, the political cults that I was a member of. Certainly we felt and were taught that we were an elite. That was the meaning that we took at that time, based on the threats that we were facing, and those threats were internal to the group, and the threat responses then included feelings of heightened anxiety, as well as, of course, what can develop is feelings of narcissism, the belief that one's on a divine mission of some kind. That's most manifest, of course, by the cult leaders, but can affect cult members for a while too, at times.
And the thing about those things is, I think over the years in our work with people, we've seen every single one of these expressed by people that have been in cultic groups. And the point is, instead of pathologizing them, we see them as naturally following consequences of the distressing, highly distressing experiences.
So to sum up then,
Yes.
in terms of how the power threat meaning framework can be applied to the experiences of people in cults or extremist groups. Common psychological distress that's reported after trauma therefore can be understood as a threat response to the coercive power that's been experienced. And this psychological distress, anxiety, depression, PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, has been consistently found in research on survivors of cults and extremist groups, survivors of domestic violence, survivors of trafficking, survivors of gangs. From the Wellspring research that I and Linda were both involved with, and much other research, has consistently shown high levels of these features of psychological distress. However, the power threat meaning framework would say that instead of asking what's wrong with the person, what psychological distress is a survivor exhibiting, we should be asking the question instead, what was wrong with the group? Or if it's a coercive relationship, what's wrong with the person or the perpetrator, as is often the word used. And how did I respond to that, including psychologically? What did I do? And I can ask myself that question personally as a survivor, but what did anyone do who was in that situation to survive? And it's that process that gives much added meaning to survivors, and it's akin to the form of psychoeducation that's common to support groups, that's common to forms of psychotherapy and recovery, which was part of the Wellspring model, but is also practiced in lots of other places by people in the field. And so asking the question, not just what is wrong with me, what psychological distress am I facing, but also what was wrong with the group, is a way of being able to understand that process of responding to threats, which led to what's commonly referred to as the psychological distress, what the framework would call a threat response. So we can apply the power threat meaning framework to cults and coercive environments more widely, to abusive relationships, trafficking and gangs, by asking what are the power dynamics which pose a threat to well-being. And these power dynamics are very well described, both in certain laws, such as the law regarding coercive control here in the UK, in the Serious Crime Act 2015, but also well documented in theories such as Lifton's work on thought reform, but in particular milieu control, the power dynamics to control people's movements day to day, hour by hour, minute by minute, the dominance over the self, which has been worked on by lots of different people. We cite our own work on totalistic identity there, but there's work on pseudo-personality also that can describe that. And then the way in which choices are bound or bounded, to use Yanni Lilacs' term. These can all be examples, and you can all think probably of other examples of the power dynamics which pose a direct threat to well-being. And this is how we can then, through the power threat meaning framework, start to understand how what we might call forms of psychological distress can also be understood as threat responses: anxiety, depression, dissociation, a combination of those things, complex post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, as well as understanding those clinically, which is important for recovery. It's also important to understand how they represent for individuals the responses to the threats that they were facing, sometimes threats to their very existence, many times threats to their well-being and safety, and that anxiety and depression, dissociation, are in many respects the natural threat responses psychologically to threats of that nature, and in particular to extreme and prolonged threats to well-being. And the power threat meaning framework in that sense seeks, in a way, and this is how we apply it to cults, to recast these forms of psychological distress as survival responses. And psychologists for many years have looked at how some of these can be seen to be protective psychologically, even though they are a form of distress in and of themselves. So we're not arguing that these are good things, but we can understand them nevertheless as being the natural protective psychological responses that people make to the threats to well-being, safety and livelihood. And of course this has been observed over many, many years in other settings. It was observed by Lifton in the case of prisoners of war and by other researchers as well, and has been observed commonly in survivors of natural disasters. In those two categories, there is never very much, in my opinion, having read a lot of that work, any controversy about the nature of the psychological distress having emanated from the threats in the coercive context of being a prisoner of war, or the trauma of being involved in a natural disaster. Therefore, I make the case very strongly that there should not be, in my view, a controversy about understanding how these are also natural threat responses to the coercion that takes place in destructive or abusive groups and relationships. The same pattern of threat response can be and is commonly observed, but the meaning that's given helps with people understanding what they've been through and the threat responses that they themselves have, in a sense, created. Again, this is not to say that they're fully in control of that. Many of those responses will be psychologically automatic almost, or subconscious, but that these are the type of responses that one would expect from any kind of traumatic situation.
Indeed. So it's very destigmatizing, which we appreciate very much. Now we move on to what's happening to everybody, the global pandemic. And we've given some consideration to how the power threat meaning framework could be applied to that. And I don't think this has been done yet either, Rod. And so we discussed this and we thought about the biological or embodied power, which we mentioned before, the virus itself. The hidden power, which is out of our control.
And here we can draw again a parallel to the experience in cults, where often hidden powers might be seen to exist in the cult leader or in other forms, in deities, or indeed by people outside the group. The point is that the power is not seen, that it's not something that can easily be pushed back against, because it's essentially out of our control. So even though in the case of a global pandemic, we know what the actual power, where it's coming from in the case of the biological virus, nevertheless, it's not visible. It's not something that we can see. And of course, that form of power is is very unempowering for the people affected, because there's nothing you can do, is the feeling about it. Obviously there's many things you can do, but the initial feeling is, what can I do, given that the power is hidden?
Well, that's a good metaphor for what happens in cults, isn't it? Because like now it's springtime in most parts of the world, not all parts, but most parts, and it's very beautiful. There are very beautiful things in bloom, and everything looks great, just like it does in that cultic group when you first are approached by it. Like, hidden within it is disease and terrible things that you cannot see. So it's a good metaphor as well.
Absolutely. And then there's the government power over everyday lives, particularly in liberal democracies such as the UK and in the USA, Canada, and many other countries. Government power over our everyday lives in terms of where we can go, who we can see, is not the usual situation, and therefore the power from government in that sense is particularly in this sense enhanced. Many support that, but that doesn't change the fact that it is enhanced in a way that is having lots of impacts, as we'll go on to examine through the framework. And linked to that, of course, is the power that government and pharmaceutical companies have with regard to survival. The power to create cures, to create vaccines, does not lie with most people.
No.
Most of us are not working for those pharmaceutical companies. There are many hundreds of thousands of people that are, but most everyone is not. Most people are not even working within the health services. And therefore, power with regard to survival for many people is seen as in somebody else's hands. Even with regard to protective equipment, personal protective equipment, PPE, the acronym that's become so popular, even in that case, the power for who gets that PPE, whether they're working in health sectors or whether they're working in other frontline industries here in the UK, I think this is also the case in North America as well. A number of transportation workers, bus drivers, train drivers, have caught COVID-19, arguably because they've not been wearing personal protective equipment. So the power over survival, arguably in that case, partly lies with government, but it perhaps also lies with the people running the companies. It's a complex discussion, but the point we're making is that the range of power, and we welcome suggestions of other forms of power that are taking place right now. But importantly, that power balance is very stark. It's reminiscent, as we were saying, of the power imbalances in abusive groups, because the power is largely in the hands of other people, or it's the power resides with an invisible virus. And the psychological effects we'll go on to look at as threat responses, but clearly this leads to feelings of powerlessness, helplessness, and also the associated feelings of depression in the face of such apparently insurmountable power. So the threats that arise from the global pandemic, many of these, of course, are obvious, but we wanted to list some of them, and again, to put them in the context of the power threat meaning framework. The biggest threat, of course, being that this is an illness at the moment without a definitive cure. There are things that can be done to help people, of course, with breathing, ventilation, etc., and a number of cures being developed. But essentially, this threat is one of an illness without, at the moment, a definitive cure. So the threat clearly then is that of hospitalization and possible death. And forgive us for putting it in such stark terms, but these are the real threats that we're all living with, and which can be difficult to deal with, but nevertheless omnipresent right now. We probably all have loved ones who are more vulnerable right now. perhaps people with underlying health conditions, perhaps people that are older, not that those are the only people that are vulnerable, of course. The threats also include threats to our work and livelihood. Either the work is becoming more risky as a consequence of the pandemic, or the work has stopped, or the work has changed beyond all recognition.
Or they've been laid off.
Well, exactly, or furloughed. And so big threats to livelihood. And of course, threats to recreation, threats to family time. And for many people, this has led to them being cut off from family members, from loved ones, physically cut off. Of course, the very technology we're using today is allowing for people to be connected. It's great that we can do that in 2020. But for others, perhaps if they don't have this equipment and technology, they may be more cut off.
And people having to isolate because they're at work they're working with patients that have the virus, so they have to come home and not be with their family or their children. That's one example of being cut off from the families as well.
And then there's the threat to the economy and to the overall infrastructure of society, depending on how much media people are listening to. I think we covered this partly in the other webinar we did. There's probably a good, healthy reason to limit the amount of media right now. But clearly, if you go on the front page of the New York Times website or others, you will see, and it's the same here in the UK, a lot of talk about the damage to the economy. We're heading into a recession. Could it be a depression? Will certain parts of society ever recover? Companies going out of business. There are some historic companies in this country that have gone out of business as a consequence of the pandemic. So the very fabric of society can, in that sense, seem to be under threat. So when you think about all of those threats, and sorry for putting them all out there in once like that, it can seem very overwhelming. It can also feel like the threat of the apocalypse. And of course, for some people who've been in cults where that's part of the ideology, and we'll come on to what that feels like for former cult members, but of course that can very much resonate to the experiences previously. And the psychological effects, what we might call the threat responses that result, would be around fear of those threats, anxiety, what's going to happen in the future, feelings of loss. I've actually put loss in twice there. Maybe that was a Freudian slip to indicate just how important it is. Things of regret. Maybe we had another thought that we left off there, but
maybe we did.
Loss times two is very important there.
It is.
But the loss, of contact with family, but also the loss of normal routines, the loss of being able to go and see people, and in the ICSA network, of course, the loss of our annual conference.
Never happened before.
Even though that's right, even though it's great that we're doing the webinars and more to come, which is wonderful, but we don't have the international conference to look forward to in Montreal this summer. We do next summer. But that loss is real for many people, and that fear in some cases that the loss may not be recoverable because certain companies, as I was saying, are not going to be able to bounce back. Some will, some won't. In that sense, the power and the threats lead then clearly to, in the framework, to psychological symptoms that can be seen as threat responses. That feeling of learned helplessness, of powerlessness, where normal behaviors and functionings are put on hold. One of the things that I think we talked about last week, we can talk about again today, is the benefits of a journal, the benefits of reflections during traumatic times. Noting the things that I'm no longer doing that I would normally be doing alongside the things that I am doing. it's very easy in this kind of situation to have the glass half empty view of the world, you know, to focus on the loss, just like we did there, times two, to think too much about the loss, rather than to think about what are the things that I'm still doing. We'll come back to that. Then there's the anxiety.
Yes, because it's almost normal, really, to have anxiety disorder now, because there's so much that is dangerous and that we need to avoid. That anxiety is really normalized at the moment. And there's been talk about people who are obsessive compulsive, particularly the ones who would constantly wash their hands and maybe have recovered from that and suddenly are being told to wash very carefully. There's hypochondriasis, like, am I already sick?
Or hypochondria as well as hypochondriasis.
Yes.
Yeah. So
am I hypochondriac? All the versions of that word.
But there's the non-clinical condition I meant of hypochondria,
yes.
which is the normal feeling of feeling maybe I'm ill. And there's been a lot of reports of people routinely now worried that their allergy symptoms at this time of the year in particular would be different if we were in the middle of the winter. And of course, that is the situation that's coming on in the southern hemisphere, but for all of us in the northern hemisphere, we're moving into high allergy season. How many of us are suffering from allergy symptoms? And of course, it's hard in the current context not to worry. And for some people, that can develop into a clinical condition. Now, there I'm using clinical language, hypochondriasis, to describe that. But of course, in the power threat meaning framework, that would be seen as an understandable threat response to the power dynamic and the very serious threats that people are facing right now. The same with paranoia. Normally, we would argue that maybe a little bit of paranoia is a good thing. To be too trusting, too gullible can be potentially dangerous. But to be paranoid, we might see as excessive. Who do we believe? That's a problematic question anyway in this day of multimedia. You know, which that's right. Which broadcaster do you believe? Which president do you believe, etc. But of course, right now the stakes are a little bit higher. Depending on who you believe, that might make a big difference to your behavior, which could make a big difference to your health. And so paranoia can be seen to be raised, particularly if you take into account the extra role for government. All of these things, of course, layer on top of existing feelings, perhaps, of paranoia, existing feelings of anxiety, because, of course, there'll be lots of other pre-existing threat responses to lived experience or to previous trauma, which we'll come back to in the case of people that have been in cults. Depression due to the losses, but also the lack of a certain return to normal in the near future. Many people deal with loss if they can see a positive path forward. What we hear, certainly in the UK, I think it's the same in the US, but it's going to vary, of course, country to country, is the fact that a vaccine is a year down the line, that the lockdowns may have to continue in some shape or form for many months. And where people are feeling a loss due to the lockdown, that's where the threat response of depression is, of course, understandable. And the trauma response, partly because of the magnitude of the power and the threats, and also how quickly the world has changed. It's the 15th of April 15th. And if we turn the clock back to March 15th, how much has changed in just a month? I mean, we didn't even know that our conference was cancelled a month ago. We were still hoping that might happen, for example. So sometimes, as we know with trauma, it's the magnitude of the threat and the impact, but also how quickly it comes on all at once. And in that sense, I personally feel that the threat response is very akin to a highly traumatic experience for people, akin to a disaster, akin to a crash, or of course to the kind of abuse, sadly, that some people suffer in cultic groups.
So how can we apply the lessons of having lived through a cult to surviving this kind of time with the global pandemic? Now, for cult survivors, these threats and responses to the pandemic would be potentially triggering. Here I am again, powerless. Again, I'm not with my family and friends. My life as I knew it is gone, or even the end of the world is coming, is nigh.
And these are real feelings that people are
Absolutely.
having right now. And apologies if putting them out there is in any sense hard for anyone. When we were putting this together, I was reflecting on my own feelings of where I felt that what we were living through now was similar in certain respects to what I'd lived through in the cults that I was a member of, and that particularly being cut off from family and friends, but that feeling of powerlessness, of not being able to function in the normal way. And here, of course, I'm thinking very much as somebody who was a first generation member, but of course the experiences again are different, and the triggering potentially different for people who were born or raised. And what we're saying here are just some tips, if you like, for how survivors of trauma should try and remember that I'm here and now. It's not back then, however much it might feel like that. That's what we would call in psychology a form of grounding.
Yeah,
you know.
grounding's like feeling the feet beneath you on the ground, knowing that you're in this moment, this time, and not going through your past trauma, even though it may feel like you are back there. And last time we explained the affect and cognitive bridges, where having a similar feeling takes you back to other times you had that feeling, or beliefs. Having certain belief and interpretation brings you back to it's just like that other time. And so remembering this is a different situation and it's affecting everyone.
Which is not typically the case in cults, where often people feel that their group is special, that they're different from most everyone, and therefore what's affecting them is not affecting other people, to the extent that one's really aware of how other people are living, because the cloistered nature of some of the groups makes that quite difficult, of course. So, you know, in larger family-based groups, of course, it's difficult to have that perception of how other people are feeling. But certainly now, it's said in some respects that the pandemic is a leveler. I don't personally accept that entirely, given differences in wealth and ability to respond. But there's something common to the threats that are potentially affecting everyone. And then a really important one is to recognize the strength that those of us have who have survived a previous trauma. If I survived that, then I can survive this, and remembering that. Now, of course, that doesn't make any of us or anyone invulnerable, but it's to recognize that we do have that strength, particularly if you have survived a trauma and got through the other side. It shows that that, of course, is really possible. And so how can what you may have learned, or how can what other people have learned, if you're not a survivor yourself, from recovering from being in a cultic or abusive group, be applied to the current situation? This is where we really think that the application of the power threat meaning framework is potentially very helpful, and we're hoping that it can be used more for helping to make sense and to think of the meanings involved in power and the threats to well-being and life and the threat responses for people in abusive groups. But we also think it can be useful now in making sense of and creating meaning with regard to the power and threats that we're facing now. And in that sense, understanding how power and threats have worked in previous trauma can, of course, hopefully be used to make sense of things now. So I'm not responsible for everything that is bad. In the cults, that's typically how members are made to feel. If you are unhappy, it's because you've not read the sacred texts enough, or you're not religious or political enough. If you think about leaving, it's because you're a bad person. Lots of different terms are used to describe those people. And right now, it's really easy to feel, well, actually, I'm at risk because I've not taken care of myself, or I'm at risk because if I'd only done this, I would have been in a different situation. Whereas, of course, it's important not to blame oneself. Of course, it's a fine line between not blaming oneself at all and then giving up all forms of control. So it's also important, I think, to remember that you can take control more than you think. And survivors of coercion have all done that. We've all done that at some point, to some extent. We've all taken back control, to use the phrase.
Yes.
And we can do that more than we think. So actually, we're not helpless. So we're not necessarily responsible for the power imbalance and the threats we're facing. But that doesn't mean that we can't, to some extent, take control and do something about it. And then there's the issue about anxiety being an okay response.
That's
to an
right.
extent.
And that the anxiety doesn't have to build up to panic. If you do get a panic attack, you can try to ground yourself and remember where you are at this time. You can try to do some relaxing breathing. You can bring yourself back to a more manageable level of anxiety, because anxiety is the norm now. And then you can keep a balanced perspective about government and big pharma.
Before we go on to that, though, we could say the same about depression, I think, too, because it's a really tough time right now. And many of us are facing not just the losses of work or family in terms of being cut off from them, but many people are facing bereavement and grief. And so it is a depressing time. Recognizing that that's an okay response, providing it's managed, is also, I think, really important. So we could have added in depression there too. So don't misunderstand us. We're not saying that anxiety and depression are good, but we're saying that they're an understandable response, which, if we can see the meaning of how we're making meaning out of the power and threats, and that's our response to them, it's much easier to manage something that you understand. And it can be useful, I think, not to feel that government and big pharma are evil. Now, we're straying potentially into political territory there, because some people might feel that all the time, in which case I respect people's views about it. But to think it a huge amount now because of the power and the threats wouldn't necessarily be helpful, because that might lead to responses that actually would be unhealthy, perhaps psychologically or even physically. So actually thinking about how we can work together and setting aside perhaps political differences. When our Prime Minister fell ill 2 weeks ago, there was across the political spectrum an outpouring of support for him, including for many people who opposed him politically. And of course, the apocalypse is not coming. Now, it may be coming for individuals who are suffering loss right now. That's a personal apocalypse, of course. But in the overall scheme, the world will continue despite the understandable fears. And then finally, resilience.
I'm more resilient than I think I am, because there's a lot of inner strength to call upon. So at this point, we'd like to open up to your questions. Thank you for listening.
That was an excellent presentation. Thank you both so much. I learned so much personally. Thank you, thank you. We did have some questions come through. Let's see, one of them was, can you flesh out interpersonal power, perhaps examples that are common in cults?
Well, absolutely. I mean, I was recruited into my first group by a particular individual who showed up at the university. You've referenced that, the university setting.
Mm.
So I think the thing about cult recruitment is that it's usually done, at least to a certain extent, in terms of interpersonal relations. There has to be a degree to which the person doing the recruiting is attractive, in the sense that they present the ideas attractive. They don't have to be personally attractive, but there has to be that bond. So I was trained in my group to how to bond with people, how to bond with contacts was actually the word that was used for people that we were seeking to recruit. So how you would develop the relationship with the contact was really important, and then we would actually have discussions privately in the inner circle of the cult about how we were doing with the contacts. So the power, of course, is therefore manifested, yes, in a group way, but also in the interpersonal relations that exist within the group. And fundamentally, that's controlling, because I didn't realize it at the time, but I also had people that were who had seen me as a contact originally, and who continued to have the relationship in that way towards me. So power relations exist between all of us, including on an interpersonal basis. In a cult, in a group like that, it's overlaid by the ideology and the aims of the group, but it's often practiced, in my view, on an interpersonal basis. And that's what makes it so difficult, because you start to feel, and again, I'm talking here from the personal experience as a first generation former member, but you start to feel loyalty to the person who recruited you. So of course, when I tried to leave, guess what? That was the person they sent round, who prevented me from leaving to begin with. And having talked over many years to many former members, that's a pattern that I've observed that exists in many different cults. I hope that answers the question. Please do ask further if not, or if you want us to speak further.
Yes, please do.
And Linda, of course.
That's all right.
Thank you for answering that. And one of the next comments that came through, I know that I can personally relate to so much. I don't know about everyone else, but this person commented, apocalyptic nightmares are very bad right now. I've been having the strangest dreams personally, and I know a lot of people are. There was a news article that came out about it, actually. It was a mental health therapist talking about how people's dreams are just much more maybe vivid or intense right now. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. I think we both had that, right?
Yes, because dreams are an attempt to deal with the things that occur during the day in one way or another. They will appear in our dreams. And when we're fearful, we'll have nightmares, and we'll have the same themes come over and over again. So the thing to watch out for there is if you're having dreams about being back in the cult, even though you're out, and because that's that affect bridge, that the fears of this time can take you right back to that. So maybe grounding yourself when you do wake up and just thinking, what is the day? Where am I? Oh, I'm in my home. You know, I'm okay. I'm not in that with that group of people anymore, because you might even have dreams exactly like that.
And the other thing about the dreams, I think, is to again recognize that these are threat responses, that we have these effect bridges. It takes us perhaps to an earlier time in our lives for some of us, and we're dreaming about those things. And that can involve, because of the situation, those apocalyptic thoughts. The thing about that is to try and rationalize that, to recognize that these are usual normative responses. They're nothing to fear in and of themselves. In fact, the more one tends to, this is not a definite rule, but the more you tend to think about what am I going to dream about, the more that you then tend to dream about it. So to coin that phrase, which I don't entirely agree with at the moment, but certainly a big thing that we have to fear is fear itself. There we go. I've paraphrased it. It's not the only thing, but it's
who amongst us hasn't had the feeling, oh, I wish I would just wake up and find out this had been the nightmare?
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Yes,
So
but lots of people are also, I mean, I've had dreams where I've been in a dangerous situation vis-a-vis the virus. I mean, like many people, we've been in lockdown for weeks, but I've had dreams where I've been out in risky situations. I mean, I expect that's quite a common dream that people are having.
Sure. Thank you. Someone made a great comment. They said, thank you for the web events. Articulating, describing occultic history with words, phrases, ideas, and metaphors is no easy task, especially if one has been for a number of years in deep disassociative states. Being able to watch and listen to the different speakers rather than just reading the articles helps me in relating to and validating ways of saying or expressing things. Thank you. That was a very kind comment.
Yes, thank you very much.
Absolutely, it's really good to hear that, and also I think it just shows that there is a silver lining to the difficulty that we're facing and not being able to meet face to face in the normal ways. That this, in other ways, is adding to the ability of people to engage. So that's an important thing to think about.
It is.
The good things that are coming.
And thank you to ICSA for putting this all together.
Definitely.
Well, for the speakers, oh my goodness, it wouldn't be possible without you guys.
It's a collective effort.
Thank you for that kind comment. Someone asked, they said, I find this framework extremely helpful. Thank you. However, when I left and was kicked out of the cult I was in, I had all of the psychological effects, strangely, except for a very brief period when I was worried about my mother's health. I have not had any of the psychological effects as a result of the pandemic. In fact, I mostly feel very good and healthy psychologically in this context. I almost have to wonder whether, in a sense, with the respect to the pandemic, am I in a cult of denial? Because indeed, between those who left the cult and those who decided to stay in the cult, it did seem on the surface that those who decided to stay were suffering less than those of us who left. The truth is, I think the reason I don't have so many negative psychological responses to the pandemic was because I was not too brought into the world as it was, and I am not so brought but in either to the threat of the pandemic. I believe that the pandemic has in part emerged as a rebalancing force. I wonder if my experience leaving the cult has helped to build a certain level of resilience and sourcing security from a higher source. So I am not so painfully affected psychologically by the pandemic. It's actually really interesting. Thank you for sharing, whoever shared that.
Yeah,
yes,
absolutely.
thank you very much for sharing that in detail so that we could really get the feel of it. And absolutely, you can use the strengths that you have developed in a resilient way. And some people are really affected differently than other people during the pandemic. So we have been focusing on anxiety and depression as being normal responses. But also, some people are having tremendously meaningful experiences at this time of a whole variety of sorts. And some people are having the opportunity to take better care of themselves. And I've been saying I don't miss my commute to the university. I can sleep in a little bit more, which is a good thing for me, you know. So there are those aspects. But thank you for sharing that.
Yes.
Sorry.
Go ahead, Rod. No, go ahead.
I was only going to say that, sorry, Ashton, but I was just going to say that I think I don't think, obviously, that there isn't a right or wrong response to a traumatic situation like this. And we call it traumatic because that's how it is for some people. But that doesn't mean I don't think that it's a problem if one's not responding to it in that way. And of course, there are individual differences in the way that we respond. And so I don't think that there's kind of a healthy, probably mid-range of responses that, you know, range from being mildly or fairly distressed through to being not very distressed, that are probably fine. I just say that because, in a sense, thinking too much about what is my response can, of course, be anxiety provoking.
Well, and in regards to how other people may be feeling, someone actually shared their own experience as well. They said, your presentations have been most helpful during this pandemic, but I've not really felt afraid of getting sick during this time. but I am triggered when the government says that you must do certain things. And if you disagree, then you are told that people are going to die. This is how I was brought up in the group that I was a part of. What they tell us to do is probably a good thing, but the authoritarian way in which it is done really triggers me. Thank you for that comment. And that goes to illustrate that everyone may be feeling or thinking a little bit differently or responding differently to this time.
Yes, and that's where the grounding is really important, because it isn't the cult, it's the government, and we can all be critics of the government, and particularly the tone sometimes of announcements. And there have been cases here in the UK of arrests where you've sort of thought, well, why did they arrest that person for walking in the park or whatever? But generally, there's quite a lot of support. But I completely get that in terms of where it can take you. But the thing to try and remember, I guess, is that that's not the group, it's the government, it's the here and now, it's for a different reason. And of course, to also think about, you know, how this is a different situation that's affecting everybody right now, rather than previously when it was a group affecting a smaller number.
And they're temporary measures that are being constantly reevaluated.
Yeah, but I think all of us, probably to a certain extent, there's a degree of uncomfortability about the idea that a government has complete power to decide in the next few months whether we can go out again, because that's not a normal situation. And so, of course, it takes you back. It does me on occasions too, because, you know, that's not normally the kind of power that governments tend to have, not in this country, not in the US. So it is a very strange and difficult time in that regard.
Definitely, because whenever there are disasters, there are issues that come up about, is it worth giving up our liberties in order to have safety overall? And some of these issues came up in response to 9/11, for example, when that happened. But there are some scary things that have been talked about, like getting into your phone so that if you're ill, they can contact your contacts and tell them that they need to self-isolate.
I don't know if anyone heard that. This was, I think, Apple Corporation were I think it was Apple Corporation going to be helping out by this use of the phones to.
Wow, and I hadn't heard of that yet. That's wow, yeah.
Yeah, that's
I think it's Apple. Apologies to Apple Corporation if it's not Apple Corporation, but I think it was.
There is some talk about that.
Interesting. Thank you. Someone also commented, thank you. Please, might you have fast track guidance for overcoming shameful learned helplessness? A huge gift is recognition of trauma resilience. Shame is kicking my arse right now.
Yes.
Oh,
well, interestingly, Martin Seligman, who came up with the concept of learned helplessness, originally looked at behavior of rats in mazes, where it didn't matter what they did, they would either get a reward or a punishment, and it was no longer contingent on learning the right way in the maze, etc. That they then gave up trying to get their reward because they saw that their behavior didn't actually lead to those consequences. And then he looked at how this was a key factor in depression for human beings. So later on in his career, he developed learned optimism. And that is the antidote to the learned helplessness. So I would refer the person that asked that question to Martin Seligman for learned optimism as one example of a way of overcoming that. Because just like we learn the helplessness, we can learn our power. We can reflect on the ways in which we are having an impact, in which ways our behaviors have led globally to some flattening of the curve, as they talk about. Like the things we are doing are having an impact. And that's part of learned optimism. Or another aspect of it is looking for the silver lining. So on the one hand, we've given up on a lot of things, but on the other hand, we're staying connected in other ways, or perhaps some of us have some extra time to catch up on projects that they'd put off, or to take care of themselves better. I mean, there are some benefits that some people are feeling during this time.
Definitely, definitely. I mean, I think it's very hard to see past the immediate future at the moment, and that's where the learned helplessness can come in, because one might be doing okay hour to hour, but what's next week, next month? What's the fall going to be like? What's the autumn going to be like? And in that sense, that's where partly trying not to think too far ahead can be a good thing. So keeping more in the here and now is probably quite a healthy response. But also going back to the issue about resilience, reflecting back how many times, if you are a survivor of trauma or being in a cult, did one feel that there was no long-term future except for the future of the group? We all will have felt like that. And therefore remembering that at that time, it didn't seem like there was any future beyond what was happening, but actually there really was, is a real thing to hold on to, because we can't see it right now. I think it's really hard for people to see right now what the future is going to be, but just remember that some of us have been there before. Maybe in one sense or another, we've all been there before. We've all had traumatic experiences, and we know that we can come out the other side. So I think that wherever we get our strength from, and you can get that spiritually as well, it's important to get that strength from somewhere in those kind of ways.
Someone commented, and I just wanted to quickly read this. Thank you. That was awesome. Very helpful. Thank you for that comment. Someone also asked, what do you think about, instead of asking, what is wrong with the abuser perpetrator, asking, what is wrong with the dynamic?
Yes, that's a very good suggestion.
Certainly. I think that looking at power dynamics, looking at the dynamics of relationships and what's wrong with them, or what are the dynamics within the group, can be a really good way of examining how people will have developed a threat response, i.e. what's often referred to as forms of psychological distress. I think what's also important is to recognize that while power, particularly for me, is exerted through relations or power relations, but nevertheless there are individuals involved. I think the danger of not recognizing that is, in a sense, to give a pass to anyone who may have perpetrated. And I'm not suggesting that the person who asked the question was implying that, but I think there's a danger if one looks purely only at the dynamics or the relations, that one can perhaps lose sight of the responsibility that certain individuals have, the leaders of cults, perpetrators in domestic violence and abuse, trafficking gang leaders in trafficking. And yeah, those people can be rehabilitated too sometimes, but actually they, first and foremost, I think, need to be held to account for the harm that they've caused. And so I think, yes, the dynamics, we need to try and look ahead and create healthy dynamics in groups, in organizations. That's really important too.
Yes.
But I think recognizing the role of perpetrators and then the responsibility that they hold is important also.
Thank you for answering that. Someone said, for those of us who have been through actual trauma at the hands of cults, it is hopefully possible to have perspective that this pandemic is different qualitatively from being subjected to willful harm.
Yeah, indeed. Because the virus obviously is not human-made. I know there are various conspiracy theories out there that suggest that it is, but I believe there's no evidence for that at all, and nor is it, as far as I can see, propagated by 5G masts either, which is another one of those conspiracy theories
Well,
out
yeah,
there.
here in the UK, some people believe that conspiracy and are burning the 5G masks.
Yeah.
But
Okay.
yeah, but you know, these experiences bring out the best and worst aspects of human experience, and but it is something. It is different when people die from a natural cause of disease as opposed to at human hands, like
Yeah.
in a war or other things.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's helpful to
Yeah.
recognize that distinction. Absolutely. I think for
Definitely.
survivors of cults, I speak as one, as I've said a number of times, I think it's helpful to recognize the difference, definitely, because I think that's a helpful thing right now in terms of coping with the current situation.
Yes.
Thank you. And thank you for who wrote that comment. It was a really interesting
Absolutely.
perspective. Someone said, I have DID and all the disassociation within parts are hard to deal with. With the pandemic, there are many fears inside while I'm dealing it with strength because upbringing in the cult was with rules to not feel no matter pain or incident. Crying was not allowed, or worry because nothing mattered in my family cult but the high priestess, my father. Thank you so much for speaking. I learned so much and appreciate you taking the time to speak to us.
Well, thank you
Thank you.
very much for that comment. And there is this opportunity for healing in embracing all of our feelings, those that are unpleasant feelings as well as pleasant feelings, because abusive groups constrict that ability to have feelings. And many abusive relationships do not allow people to show their fears and their pain or to cry. And this is all part of the human experience, and being fully alive is having all of those feelings.
Thank you. And thank you for being vulnerable and sharing that experience. And what
Yeah,
you've been going through.
absolutely.
Someone said, along with all of this, it's been 3 years since going completely no contact. My father, leader, called on Easter, first time in 3 years. My phone goes to voicemail after only 3 rings. I didn't see the number quick enough. On voicemail, he didn't say anything and hung up. He told a family member he tried to call me with a poor me kind of attitude. But now I'm dealing with nightmares, triggering heart-pounding guilt, shame, nausea, anger. What do I do if and when he calls again? Feeling bereavement and grief. It's like getting a call from your dead parents. My mother has disowned me because I won't talk to dad, like in the book Educated. I don't know if you guys have read that.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
They are turning 80, so their death isn't impossible. I feel I would still be so easily diminished and manipulated. He hasn't changed, so I guess I should probably just avoid talking to him and remain steadfast. His birthday was the day after Easter.
Well, this, of course, is a very personal and delicate matter where there isn't going to be a right or wrong answer. I do think that being in the situation of the pandemic doesn't really radically or automatically change the issues that were going on before it. So families that were close or getting along well before this are probably being supportive of one another now. And there's definitely been a documented rise in domestic abuse situations because some people are in lockdown with their abuser. So what was going on with them before has just continued, and escape is even harder. So there's always the possibility to be rethinking what one should do about one's relationships, but it doesn't necessarily follow that something different has to happen under these circumstances.
Someone asked, just as cults reach out to individuals at vulnerable times in their lives, going away to college, during loss, etc., Can you address how people are more vulnerable to proselytizing and conspiracy theories right now?
Yes, well, that's a good point. First of all, some of the cultic groups are kind of parasitic and they come out of the woodwork when there are problems, and they make up names for new organizations that are going to help people. And instead of helping people, they use that as an opportunity to recruit. So we have to be wary of that. And just con artists have come out and put notes under people's doors that they would help them get supplies and whatever, when actually they're trying to rob them, just get entry into the house. So it does, there are those kinds of things that we need to be careful about.
I think people are, of course, some people are disconnected and dislocated from family, friends, and from their normal work environments, and those can be risk factors for people being recruited into cults, of course, just as different rites of passage, like going to college, etc., can be risk factors. In my experience, however, groups will successfully, unfortunately, recruit people whether they've got those risk factors or not. So yes, of course, more people may have those risk factors right now, but there'll also sadly be other people without them who may also fall victim of those recruitment techniques. So I think it's important not to overdo the feeling that some people are necessarily a lot more vulnerable than others. It's important to be aware of what our vulnerabilities are, however, and in that regard to also recognise that having an open mind to big possibilities is one of the risk factors for recruitment. You know, if I had going to my own experience, a very cynical view of the world, I probably wouldn't have been open to the ideas of the group that recruited me, and certainly for people who recruited into groups, having that open mind. Now, there is some evidence to show that during national crises, whether it's wars or in this case a pandemic, that the anxiety, the low-level anxiety that most people feel can in a sense reduce the likelihood of people being open to those ideas, because people become more cautious, people become a bit more risk averse. And so I wonder, and this is just speculation on my part, whether actually there may be a slight inoculizing effect of the pandemic. Maybe that's wishful thinking. I hope that's true, that some of the cults that recruit online, because of course it's going to have to be the cults that recruit online that would be able to move forward in most part right now. But I'm kind of hoping that there'll be that kind of inoculizing effect. I draw, when I say that, on quite a lot of work in political science, which shows that during national crises, that political views tend to a certain extent, depolarize, that people tend to move to less extreme positions. There's some speculation as to what impact that may have in November in the US with regard to the election right now. And so that's what I draw on when I say that there may be a similar perhaps inoculizing effect on people being open to more extreme ideas. It's difficult to say. I think there's going to be a range of responses to the situation.
And that was a great question. Thank you for asking that. I think it's been on a lot of people's minds, especially being on social media. I know I'm seeing people who I never would have thought of would jump on the conspiracy theory bandwagon who just have all of a sudden. And it's really interesting to see that process. So thank you. The last question I have that came through is, could you provide a web link to the findings of your CPTSD research?
Yes, we can certainly provide a link to where we published on the research that we did looking at psychological distress in former cult members. Absolutely, we can provide that. For definite. Now, with regard to different forms of complex PTSD, there's other research as well that we could point people to that's looked at that across different settings. So we're by very far not the only people that have been doing research on that topic, but very happy to share what we've done. And those have been great questions, everyone.
Yes,
Thank you so
thank you
much
so
for
much.
those.
Yes, and what we can do is if you guys wanted to send me those resources via email, I can
Yeah.
send out an email to everybody who listened to
Sure.
today on the
Okay.
CPSD. Someone's also asking, and a link to Learned Optimism too.
Oh,
as
sure.
well.
Absolutely.
So
That would
we
be
we can
useful.
kind of gather anything you guys want to send me in terms of
Okay.
resources. I can pass
We'll
along
do
for
that.
you.
Great.
Someone also said, thank you so much. Although I don't have any fear regarding the pandemic and am taking all the proper precautions to stay safe, your presentation is helping me process the PTSD feelings that have coincidentally resurfaced happening at the same time. So thank you. I'm so happy to know that this has been helpful for everybody. I really appreciate, and I know our presenters appreciate as well, the comments, the questions, and, you know, I'm so sorry to hear that some of you are going through such a hard time right
Absolutely.
now, either with family members or just even dealing with your own inner anxieties during this time. And I hope that this has been a resource and a helpful resource for you. I know it has been for me. So thank you so much to the presenters for joining
And
me
thank
again.
you, Ashlyn.
Yes,
Yes,
thank you
yes,
very
thank
much.
you. Tomorrow we have 2 talks going on actually, so please reference the schedule and see what's coming up next. We just added a new session that I wanted to quickly announce. We're wrapping up this entire series on Tuesday, the 21st of this month, and at noon Eastern and 8 p.m. We will have a live presentation with Q&A with Jilly Jenkinson and Rachel Bernstein. It's just going to be, as far as I understand, kind of a Q&A lightning round to just wrap up the series. Any questions, any concerns you guys have, please, you know, bring them to us at that time. So thank you so much, everybody. Thank you to you both. Please stay safe. I miss
You
you
too.
both.
You
Hopefully I
too,
can
and
visit
everyone.
again once all this is better. And everyone go well and be safe. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely.
You.
Take care, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.